All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So as you heard me mention earlier, this is the first event of our month-long series celebrating sci-fi and fantasy. And I'd love to know what made you fall in love with science fiction and fantasy novels. Were there any particular authors or novels that really inspired you or to become a professional writer yourself?
I think probably one of the first ones I remember reading was Andre Norton. Um, when the library that I used to go to when I was a kid was had the children's section right next to the science fiction and fantasy section, and so I tended to I should have gone to the rest of the children's section. Instead, I went down through science fiction and fantasy. But I think a lot of the science fiction and fantasy books had um, female characters on the covers, and there wasn't a lot of that in the children's books that were like adventure books, which is what I like to read. A lot of it was directed toward boys, and the girls who were there were always the babysitter or the load. It was very rare to find, children's books with um, that were straight up adventures with female main characters. And so I think I was gravitating towards science fiction and fantasy because of that.
That's great. And so one of my favorite aspects of sci-fi, which you do so well in your books, is the world building. The world of your Murderbot Diaries series. It's fascinating. It's very immersive and intricate. Could you tell us a bit about what that process looked like when you set out to create the world for this series?
Um, I originally I was only just going to be the one novella, All Systems Red, and I didn't plan it as a series. But to have a world that would have Murderbot, would have sec units that were basically enslaved, um, to do those things, it had to be a corporate dystopia, basically. So starting with that, and thinking about what we have now in our corporate semi-dystopia, and extrapolating on that, thinking of how it would look um, to the various different people in it. It's going to be really complex. So what I wanted to do was show it just from Murderbot's point of view, and it only talks about the things it's interested in. So that makes it a lot easier to kind of convey a very complex world, because you're only getting bits and snippets of it, and that the reader needs to know at that moment, which is the best way, in my opinion, to do world building. You never want to dump a whole bunch of it on people, because they're not going to be interested in things they don't need to know for the story. Um, so yeah, and it's a different kind of world building, very much from fantasy, where you want to give the feel of you want to show more of the world. It's you want it to feel very rich and detailed, and so you want POV characters who will talk about it more, who will notice these things more. Um, but I try to make the world building for Murderbot just as vivid as I can, considering it's really not describing things very well. It's really talking about the use things are to it, and the emotional effect they have on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so another thing that your books do an excellent job of is kind of flipping the typical tropes of AI that we typically see in science fiction of, them wanting to become human and take over the world. As you establish right from the beginning, Murderbot is much more interested in delving into endless hours of pop culture and media consumption and really seems to reject its organic nature. What inspired you to go this route when crafting the character?
Well, there's a lot of good stories where AI want to become human, but I think I was inspired mostly by Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie, which is about an AI that is a spaceship that's basically forced into a human body and really doesn't like it. And thinking about, for an AI to become human, what it would have to give up is just this multiplicity of vision, of being able to take in all this information and see all these different things simultaneously, and to try to put that into a human brain, it just wouldn't work. Um, and also just because I wrote it, um, started the first one, would have been 2016, just very angry about, about a lot of things going on and all this stuff happening. And just the idea that of a character that could go off and just destroy everything, and instead just really wants to, do self-care by watching TV, which is kind of what I wanted to do. It's like, what do you really want to do? Do you want to destroy the world, or do you want to watch TV? Well, I really want to watch TV. And that's basically what it's based on.
Well, that's certainly a very relatable feeling.
Yeah, and also the idea that it's taking in the media and the shows to help it contextualize its own emotions, and they kind of teach it how to deal with its emotions and how to understand really what's going on. That was kind of a big factor too.
That's great. Well, since we have so many folks joining us here from all around the country and even folks outside the country, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into audience Q&A. We already have some good questions in here. So this is an interesting question from Katie. Like Murderbot, I swear quite a bit, usually when I'm highly amused, annoyed, or scared. Do you intentionally give Murderbot this trait to emphasize how emotional it can be?
Yeah, and I think I don't usually write in first person. Murderbot, there's only one other story I've done in first person in like 30 years of writing, other than Murderbot. And I think I wanted it to be as different as possible from the way I do third person. And so I just kind of let it flow and let the character try to try to get the character voice just the way I heard it in my head. And I thought, okay, I'm just gonna let it swear. I do cut back a lot of the swearing when I edit it, because sometimes it gets to be a lot, and it's like, this is not helping. This is not really giving a good picture of what's going on. So I'll go back and take out bits and pieces of it.
And since you kind of touched on the editing a bit, what does that look like for you? Are you kind of drafting everything out and then going back and doing multiple revisions, or do you have an editor who just sends things back to you? And what does that look like for a non-writer like myself?
Well, I do have an editor, or a professional writer has an editor. They're the person who usually acquires it for the publisher. But when I actually write it, I don't draft and then go back from the beginning. I have to keep it straight in my head, and so I'm constantly changing my mind about what's going on and having to figure things out as I go along, which means going back in and putting stuff. So I'm sort of constantly moving forward a little bit, but going back and doing a lot of revision. And a lot of writers don't do that. They draft the whole thing and then revise it. But this is the way I like to do it. And it actually takes probably about the same amount of time, because when I get to the end of what's really the first draft, I've done a lot of revision. It's probably more like a third or fourth draft, instead of having to just go back, and because I would just get confused. The stories are so complicated, and especially in Murderbot, and there's so many moving parts. Basically, if I didn't make changes as I went along, I forget what I was doing.
Yeah, I mean the continuity and the world building aspect, that seems almost as complicated as the storytelling itself.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's see, we've get to some more questions here. So question from Rebecca. So how much of Murderbot is actually human?
Really, not very much. It's got human neural tissue, and it's got some organic tissue, which is similar to human tissue, but is not really. It's a lot tougher on its body, but really pretty much the neural tissue is the only thing that would be genetically human.
All right, let's see. We have a question that I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience are curious about. Do we have a release date yet for the show, the Apple TV adaptation of Murderbot?
Not the exact date, but it should be sometime next year.
And so I had a question for you about that. So what is it like seeing stories you've created in your head now being adapted to the screen? And as a consulting producer, is it really important to you that it stays true to the original source material? Or are you okay with it deviating from the novels a bit?
Well, it's enormously cool to see it happen. I think probably some of the coolest thing was when they started to send me the concept art and um, the drawings and everything, the what the habitats would look like, and the map of the planet, and all these other things. And the second coolest thing was when they sent me the basically the camera test of the actors in costume, and that was just I mean, I think I had that picture on the screen of my laptop for a month. It was just it was incredibly cool. um, with Murderbot, it's very difficult to keep it close to the book because it's a first person narrative that's very internal. And especially later on in the later volumes, a lot of stuff just happens inside software. So you have to take that and make it basically, three-dimensional visual. And so the story does have to change. And we talked about it throughout, what the changes would look like. And with a TV show, that's not just you and the producer and the producers and writers. It's basically the all the different companies that are involved in the making of it get a say. So there's a lot of negotiation and everything. But I'm really happy with how it turned out. And I think it's going to be really cool, and I hope people enjoy it.
Oh yeah, I'm certainly excited for it, and I know a lot of folks in the audience here are as well. Let's see, we have some questions here from Magdalene. Has a very specific question about network effect. Does Amina find her uncle Tiago calling her my daughter deeply annoying, or is that just me projecting?
It's not my daughter. It's not really. It's an endearment. It translates directly as my daughter, but it's used as a kind of a general endearment. So she doesn't find it annoying. It's just part of their culture.
Right. Okay, the question here from Jessica. In System Collapse, how much of your own research went into the circular hatches debate that the characters were having?
I didn't research it, but that's something I'd noticed, particularly in Twin Peaks. Um, uh, David Lynch uses the symmetry a lot to it's several key points to basically scare the crap out of you by having something, the cemetery, or the sudden disruption after you thinking you're, you know uh, so that's kind of what I was thinking of, is that um, uh, them noticing that. But I didn't actually do a lot of research on it. But I think probably round hatches are used a lot in science fiction TV, even horror movies, and that kind of thing, because it's visually interesting as opposed to a normal square hatch, which is probably what you would mostly have.
And while we're on that topic, how much research do you do when crafting a futuristic sci-fi novel in general? Are you researching AI? Are you researching technology that could give us space travel one day? Or are you kind of just letting the storytelling lead the way?
Not really. I'm just making stuff up, because one of the things it's really hard to do in science fiction is extrapolate futuristic technology, because technology has changed so quickly, and the speed it changes, I think, is accelerating. Um, as more changes feed more changes, and everything like that. If you read earlier science fiction, like even stuff from like the 90s, 80s and 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't a lot of anticipation about what cell phones would be like.
Mhm.
Probably the only thing that really anticipated that was Star Trek, was the first Star Trek with the tricorders and the communicators. Like if they put that unit together, they would have basically had something close to a modern iPhone. So the things that are seem the most simple to us now, it seems like are the hardest things to come up with. So I don't do that kind of research. I just make things up and try to come up with far future technology. There are authors who are really good at that. I would recommend Yoon-Ha Lee, particularly is really good at that kind of thing, and Aliot de Bodard in coming up with science fiction settings, and that just the way that the technology is used in the people's environment is just seems extremely futuristic.
Right. Well, we have some questions here related to being a writer that I wanted to get into, because I think we have some writers in the crowd here. So how has book publishing changed over the years, in your opinion? You had your first novel published in 1993. Do you have any new tips for new authors that you wish you knew getting into it?
I think it's changed a lot. In the 90s, we were still doing everything on paper. And like literally, you would send in your manuscript, which was a hunk of paper like this thick to go for a 300-page novel. And editors used to be able to tell the word count by how heavy the manuscript was. They were so used to handling these giant chunks of paper. And they would do the editing and the copy edit and everything on this single chunk of manuscript, and so it would go back and forth in the mail, and it was terrifying if it was lost at that point, because I'm not sure how, since Xeroxes are expensive, so I'm not sure how much they even did that, but and it was just a pain in the butt having to do all your corrections and revisions and stuff like that on the final version. And then it all had to be retyped to go into the typesetter, and then it would just introduce all these new errors, and then you had to basically go over it again and again. So it's the process is so much easier and more streamlined now. I think the thing that's probably worse is you used to be able, the book would come out and you would really have no idea how it was doing. Only the publisher knew that, and that was after I could tell from the orders and stuff that were coming in, but you were not privy to that information. So it would probably be 6 months to a year before you'd have any idea how the book was doing. And I kind of like that better. Nowadays, people can literally, your book can come out and you have so much information, from the Amazon ranking to all these other things. You can see what libraries have ordered it. You can see all these other things, and you can watch your book fail in real time, basically. So, and I can't imagine how stressful this process is for a new author. I mean, it was stressful enough when you weren't having that deluge of information. And if people wanted to insult you and tell you how horrible your book was, they had to write you a letter. And now it's like, when you're on social media, you get it from all sides, and yeah, it's just a lot more. It seems like it's a lot more stressful process. I don't remember how many, when I first started there, I don't remember new authors having to end up, having to go into therapy and having these problems because of the stress. That seems to happen a lot now from people I know. So it's always been a stressful profession, but I think it's just the stress level has just increased so dramatically.
Wow, I can only imagine. Let's see. We had another question here from Vincent. How hard is it to create a world with rules and then you have to abide by them as the writer? Are you kind of alluded to this already, but are you constantly having to kind of go back and correct yourself to keep everything straight?
Yeah, it's like I don't set up rules before I start writing. I evolve the rules as I go along and to conform to what I need to do with the story and the plot. The hard part is with writing a series is after a few books in, you start forgetting things, and the using the sentence, well, this had never happened to her before. becomes incredibly complex because you might have said something in a previous book that you don't remember where it did. So you have to go back and check things like that so you don't contradict yourself. And the continuity becomes, you start understanding how like long-running TV shows end up with what seems to you as a fan, these huge continuity errors that just seem so obvious. It's like, because you forget, even if you wrote it yourself, you forget. So yeah, I don't like have like a world building Bible or anything like that I set up. I probably should. The most I'll do is, particularly with the fantasy novels, when I make up a character name or make up a place name, I'll copy it into another file. So I'll have all that information where I can find it easily instead of having to look back through.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to ask you about your recent fantasy series. So you recently started a new fantasy series with Witch King, and I've heard that a sequel is forthcoming next year, I believe.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about the series and what inspired you to return to fantasy after seeing so much success with your sci-fi Murderbot series?
Well, I wrote Witch King actually in 2020, and I was trying to do another Murderbot and was just having terrible writer's block. And that was right when the pandemic first started and lockdowns were happening. You were supposed to go out and all this stuff. And a lot of people I knew had writer's block just because of the stress and the uncertainty. And a lot of people are having trouble reading. I was still, there was a lot of actually really good, excellent fantasy novels coming out that year. So I was still reading, and I felt like I needed to do something different. And so I just kind of pulled out a scene I'd tried to, had laying around for years that I'd tried to make work into a story, and it just wouldn't happen. And started it again and just kind of let myself go and do something fun. And that turned out to be Witch King. I was also kind of really inspired by, there were a lot of Chinese dramas, fantasy dramas coming on Netflix at that point. I don't think they'd really had a lot of them before, but for some reason they got a whole lot of them that year. And one of them was The Untamed, which is really, was the first one I watched. And that's a really cool fantasy drama, and it tells the story in slightly different ways. And so that was really an inspiration to me.
Oh, that's great. We have a lot of folks in the chat saying how much they loved Witch King. Um, let's see. Let me get back to one of these questions here. So we have another question about the Murderbot series from Marissa. My question is about the sec units and how they work. What is fluid? We had a whole discussion on whether they can cry or if they have some sort of saliva so they can talk properly. Does Murderbot need to brush its teeth? And it references dreaming sometimes. Can it have nightmares?
Definitely can have nightmares. I'm not sure it's dreaming like a human would dream. It's probably because its neural tissue does basically store information, but it does it in a different way than the non-organic parts of it. So there'd be a conflict there, but and I think I go into that a little bit in System Collapse, where it's having these basically false memories that are caused by trauma that present like an actual memory in the non-organic brain, but it's actually, a trauma response, a trauma nightmare, basically. So yeah, the fluid, again, I'm not like a roboticist or anything like that, but it seemed like to me that the non-organic tissue would still need to be fed by something like blood, works for us. So it would need something similar. I actually have a friend who works in that kind of medical technology of like designing, now I've lost the word. like Things for Your Heart and stuff like that, he would probably be able to answer that a lot better than I could.
All right, let's see. We have a question here from Gamebird, also about Murderbot. So Murderbot is famously vague when it comes to describing itself and its emotions, but there are indications that it has expressions and shows emotions on its face it doesn't directly relate in the narration. Has there been any point in the stories wherein Murderbot has smiled, laughed, or conversely has it wept?
No, not that you know of. It does not describe those things. It obviously finds things funny because it talks about that, but and finds things heartbreaking, but it does not talk about its emotional reactions or visible emotional reactions.
Let's see, we have a question here from Raquel. How is the process different when writing shorter fiction versus writing longer novels and series?
That's kind of, people have asked me that before, and it's kind of hard to describe. It's like when it starts with the story you want to tell, what length, because originally when Murderbot, All Systems Red, was going to be a short story. And I don't do very many short stories because I don't tend to write well at that length, which usually 7,000 to 10,000 words. And so really quickly, I realized it needed to be longer, but a novella is typically, I forget the exact designation, but it has to be under 40,000 words, but over 30,000 is a comfortable length for one. So that's what I was going for. And so basically I think about the length I want. And then as I tell the story, I realize whether I need to add plot complication or take it away. And there's been a couple of times writing novellas, one of the Raksura novellas, I realized it was coming in too short, and I kind of had to step back and add another layer of plot complication to the story and able to get me to the right length.
Okay. So I heard you kind of shout out Ann Leckie earlier. I had the pleasure of interviewing Ann Leckie last week or last year for Sci-Fi September 2023. So we have a question here from Olivia. What are you currently reading? What other authors inspire you?
A lot. Recently, Nevo has become one of my favorite authors. She, I think, won a Hugo maybe for Empress of Salt and Fortune, which is a short novella, fantasy, basically, that just really tells an entire epic story in one novella, basically, because it's about storytelling, and it's about history versus the story that we remember, and that's a theme in a lot of those books. One of her novels is The Chosen and the Beautiful, which is a fantasy retelling of The Great Gatsby, which is just gorgeous. And also Siren Queen, which is set in the same world, which is about early Hollywood, except it's run by the Fae. And it's just very dark and very kind of creepy, and again, just beautiful fantasy at the same time. Aliette de Bodart is a longtime favorite. She does a bunch of different things, but most recently, far future fantasy set in a kind of space empire based on ancient Vietnam. And N.K. Jemisin, the fifth season, and those books, I love all her work. Kate Elliott is actually going to have a couple fantasy novels out pretty soon, maybe next year. And her most recent book was space opera. I think the first one was Furious Heaven. Oh no, it's Unconquerable Sun. And just really cool space opera, giant empires colliding and everything. Just really excellent. And she's written a ton of other great books. Andrea Hairston has some wonderful books. Some of her older books are being reprinted by Tor, and she's had some new ones out, mostly fantasy. We'll Do Magic for Small Change is one of my favorites. That's just a fabulous book. And I could go on and on. I'm sure there's lots of others, but yeah.
That's great. And do you have much time to do reading for fun as a professional writer?
I try to make time. Again, during the pandemic kind of really threw me off in a lot of ways. So I haven't been reading as much. And I'm not reading as much different stuff, I think. I'm hoping I can get back into a more regular schedule, because there's some really good books coming out. Kay Arsenault Rivera has just had a new book come out, which I've forgotten the name of already, but it's sitting on my iPhone. And her first novel was The Tiger's Daughter, which was a fantasy, and I thought it was just a fabulous epic fantasy. It was the beginning of a trilogy. So there's just so many books I need to just kind of sit down and read. So I probably need to take some time off at some point and try to catch up. Oh, also Rebecca Roanhorse with her new trilogy. I think the Mirrored Heavens, maybe. I think the last book in the trilogy just came out recently, and I want to read that so badly, but I haven't had time.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for all the recommendations. Let's see, we have some good questions here from Rebecca related to gender identity and the kind of non-binary nature of many of the characters in different novels. Could you just expound upon that a bit, and what made you go with that direction with the way you write your characters?
Well, I think it made sense for Murderbot. It made sense for it not to have a gender. And as the story went on, as I kind of developed the character, I felt like it made sense for it to really lean into that and not see it as a lack, that's something that the company had taken away from it, but as its personality, an important part of itself, basically. With the other, I think it's just as I've grown over the years, I really think being non-binary, for me personally, seems like more of a natural human state. There's been so much about our sexual identities and our gender identities that are imposed on us by culture, and particularly Victorian culture. Really did a number on humanity of and enforced that on a lot of basically everybody it could get to. So that's just something I've been kind of exploring in my writing for a long time.
Great. So before we have a lot of Murderbot questions here, but I wanted to get back to Witch King and your Rising World series. So I know that you said that the book 2 is going to be coming out next year. Do you already have an idea? Is this going to be a trilogy? Is it going to expand longer than that, or
it's going to be at least a trilogy. When I wrote the first one, I start the way I usually start, is because for a long time, I could only sell one book at a time. So I didn't know if I was going to be able to sell the series or not, because, the first book might be the only one, and then the publishers don't want another one. So I kind of tried to develop series as standalone as possible until I'm for sure know I'm going to be able to finish the story. And Witch King, I wasn't sure if people were going to like it. And so it's kind of originally a standalone book, but as I was writing it, I could think of things, directions I wanted to go in. So being able to do a second one, I definitely knew then that I could start a story that I could finish in the third book, basically. So, and it's just a really interesting world. And it's like when you build a world that complex, you kind of don't want to walk away from it right away. You want to go and do something else in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So once, and similar with the Murderbot books, once you made that decision to make it into a series and expand upon it, did you already kind of have an idea in your head? Of course, no spoilers, but how it would end? Or do you already kind of have an ending in mind at this point?
Sometimes I do, for some stories, and for others I don't. So Witch King, I really don't know where it's going to end up. There's various places where it could go. The second book, Queen Demon, still is having the past and the present. One of the things I don't want to do is I don't want to make it a typical epic fantasy where I'm describing this big war. I'm trying to just only show, in the past at least, key instances of development. And so of these historical incidents that in the present section are misremembered by a lot of people, even though, you know, Kai and the others are the ones who lived through them. So it can go a lot of places, but I have to write another Murderbot before I do the third book, the third Witch King book. So I'm actually trying not to think too much about it, because I'll get distracted and want to write something besides what I'm actually supposed to be writing right now.
And what is it that you're writing right now?
Well, I'm trying to start a new Murderbot, but I only finished Queen Demon. I was very late because last year I got really slowed down. I had breast cancer, and kind of was still recovering from that for a while. And so it really pushed my deadline back. So I only finished it in July, and it still has to go through editorial. So it's going to be probably an interesting, fast turnaround, hopefully. So yeah, I haven't started on it yet. I just recently got back. I went to Scotland for the Worldcon. So when we stayed like an extra week, so I'm still now recovering from my vacation, basically. So that's one of the things I need to get started. I had a couple other short stories and I had to write and some other things. So that's going to be up next.
And are you kind of scheduling out your writing schedule, or how does that work when you get to set your own schedule like that? It seems daunting.
It is daunting. Mostly, you just kind of plow forward and try to get all this stuff done. As Murderbot's gotten popular, I get more and more opportunities to do stuff, but I'm not a super fast writer. So I end up having to say no to a lot of things, just because I know if I say yes to this, it's gonna take me, a month or 2 months to write like a short story, and it's gonna stress me out the whole time, knowing that I'm taking time away from a book that would be basically proceeding much faster in that time period. So yeah, it's just, you kind of have to be aware of your own limitations.
Great. Let's see, we've had a lot of commenters and folks kind of talk about the unreliable narrator and then the first person narration of the Murderbot series. So JD Murphy is asking here, how do you walk the fine line between spelling it out for the reader and letting them discover things for themselves based on, kind of limited information?
Well, I don't tend to plot out a lot of stuff in advance. I kind of know where I'm going to a certain point, and usually when I get to that point, I know what the next point is. So I'm kind of finding things out at about the same pace the reader would, which is really cool when you come up with just things that you kind of throw in, and then later on you realize that can be really important to what you want to do next. So I think that really helps, because I'm kind of coming up with the information right at the moment I'm revealing it to the reader. I know people actually who wrote mysteries that way. I had a friend who did that, and his were always impossible to figure out because he didn't know who the murderer was at the beginning either. So by the time he was ready to reveal it, he'd figured it out. And I kind of don't like that kind of thriller where you as the viewer or the reader know so much more than the characters, because it makes me impatient. I always like stuff where it's a mystery and I'm kind of finding it out the same time the characters do. So that's what I like to write.
Great. Let's see. Question here from Simba. Are there any plans for another book in the Emily and the Hollow Worlds Sky World set?
Not right now, though the Tor.com is going to reprint them, I think in a single volume, maybe next year. I think that's when it's supposed to come out. They picked up my backlist of things that had books that had gone out of print and have been reprinting them. Like the most recent one, Wheel of the Infinite, is actually and I've revised it from the earlier version, and it's coming out in November.
And how different is that experience writing kind of a YA style novel as opposed to something for adult audiences?
The thing that's most different, I think, at least for the way I've done it, is the character is much younger and much less experienced.
Mm.
So when you're writing an older character, because usually my characters are at least in their 30s, sometimes 40s or 50s, or with Witch King in their hundreds. There is they have so much more experience. Their reactions to things are colored by that experience. When you're writing a character where it's their first time to be in danger, their first time to have a loss, to lose someone and all that, it's a different emotional experience. So you always have to keep that in mind.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd have to imagine that would be kind of a challenge. You might have to sort of keep yourself in check to be like, okay, would they know that? Yeah, would they feel that way in that situation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. We had a good question here from Roxana. I wanted to ask, are we going to find out about the event that led to Murderbot becoming who they are and their memory, since their memory was erased? They've investigated this a bit, and I was wondering if there's an overarching story arc that will be completed.
Maybe not, because I think it's already, when it in artificial condition, it already found out basically the reason it tried so hard to and was able to get rid of the governor module was because it was forced to kill people against its will, basically. So that's kind of the thing that made it who it is now. I don't really know what the arc is going to be yet in the last two. There's going to be two more Murderbot books, or novellas. I'm not really sure yet what I'm gonna do with them. I know they're gonna jump off from where System Collapse ended, and deal with kind of Murderbot's quest now for mental health, now that it's realized that that's the thing that it kind of should be working on.
We had several folks in the crowd here make comments about how great the audiobook versions of your Murderbot series are. So do you have any input into the reader of the audiobooks of the voice actors?
I do now. Kevin R. Free does the Murderbot books, and Eric Mock is doing the Witch King. And I did get to choose them. With Kevin R. Free, it was just, he was the only person that the casting director suggested, and he was perfect. And with Eric Mock, they suggested like 12 or 13 people, and I had to go through all these voice samples and try to decide. And it was incredibly difficult because everybody was really good. But Eric was one we decided on. And with some things earlier in my career, I haven't been able to pick the person, but yeah, I was able to, but now I am.
Right. Let's see. Good question here from Jessica. You're amazing at describing physical action of characters in high intensity situations. Do you visualize this or act things out in some respect? Is there anything you do to help you write these physical action scenes and to get that to translate well on the page?
Well, it's a lot of experience at doing it, really, because when I first started out, sometimes I'd have to draw things. Like when you're first writing particularly complex scenes, even if you don't tell the reader everything that's going on in the scene, because mostly they don't need to know. You only really need to know what the point of view character sees and does. but as a writer, you need to kind of know where the other characters are. So if it was a complex, I'd actually draw out, okay, this person's over here, that person. And once you kind of know what everybody's doing, even if you don't need the reader to know that, it's easier to sort it out. So, and actually with the action scenes, the thing that when I went from doing mostly fantasy and it was kind of earlier 17th century and then gaslight fantasy. And then when I did 2 Stargate Atlantis novels and having to switch to like modern weapons and realizing I need more people in this scene and it needs to be moved faster and all that because it's the weapons and how dangerous they are and how they can how many people you can kill at a distance basically is changes the whole complexion of how you can do the action, which came in handy when I did a Star Wars novel later. With Murderbot, the thing that makes it incredibly complex is its ability to take in all this information and be monitoring different systems and different camera views while it's doing an action. And basically, it's the only character I've written that can basically think and do like multiple things at once, like an AI could. And so it's just makes the action scenes incredibly complex. And so there's a lot of going forward a little bit and then going back and correcting because realizing that, okay, it would be able to see this, it would know this was coming. So yeah, it's one of the things that makes them very difficult to write.
Yeah, I can imagine. Let's see, we've had several folks kind of talk about the differences between writing a fantasy and sci-fi novel. And you're a bit unique in that respect that you write in both genres. There are a lot of writers that strictly do sci-fi or strictly do fantasy. So Teresa asked here, can you share your thoughts on writing fantasy versus science fiction? Well, what are the different approaches or challenges for you between them, and what goes into your decision to write something as a fantasy or a fiction novel?
I don't see a lot of difference between them because the kind of science fiction I'm working with is very far future. So you have technology that you don't explain, and it's not important that the reader know how it works. And then you have magic, and actually, I don't think people need to explain magic or need to have a magic system in a book. I think as long as you've got kind of limitations. So you're not like, why doesn't everybody just fix everything with magic? There are limitations in how you can do it. I kind of like to think of it as where power comes from. And Witch King is very much about that, is there's different ways to source power, and some of them are terrible and some of them are not, and some of them are not available to just anybody and that kind of thing. And with technology, it's just, it might as well be magic. So I don't see a lot of difference between them. It's basically magic and technology are just part of the overall structure of your world, of the world that your story is set in.
And do you find that when you're coming up with the kind of genesis of these stories, is it more coming from the character and the scene, or is it the setting? What
It's always really complex for me to try to separate those two, because the world has to be the kind of place that would create the character, and the character has to be the kind of person who would be created and live in that world. So they really kind of have to come together, and one kind of determines the other.
Okay, that makes sense. Good question here from Magdalene. It was wonderful to get Home from Mensa's point of view. Might we get other short stories from other characters' point of view in that series?
There is going to be another Murderbot-ish short story. It's actually it's actually about Art and Art's crew, and it's from one of the crew members' point of view.
Great. So good question here. What led you to writing the Stargate Atlantis novels? Were you collaborating as a writer with the franchise in a writer's room, for instance?
No, it was a tie-in novel. So you don't get to, with tie-in novels, you don't usually get to even talk to the production company. There are some instances where that's not the case, but most of the time it's a publisher that's licensed by the production company to do the tie-in novels.
And what does that process look like when you're doing these tie-in novels where you're taking this pre-existing world, pre-existing story? Is that something where you're kind of working back and forth a lot about cross-referencing existing works, or how does that work?
It depends. With Stargate Atlantis, it was pretty simple. It was, I think, I can't remember the second season. For the first one I did, the second season had not come out yet. So I was working basically with a story that was from the first, would have been, would have taken place sometime in the first season. With the second one, it was taking place sometime in the second season. So I was able to basically just pick what story, where I wanted to set it. They didn't really care very much, about I think the only instruction I got was don't kill off any characters who aren't dead in the show, basically. And some of them are a lot more complicated and a lot more picky, like Star Wars. So it just all depends on what the rights holder wants you to do, and sometimes they don't really care that much, and sometimes they care a lot. So,
And
it's
with
kind of,
something as iconic as Star Wars, do you get as much creative license, or is it fairly contained what you're able to do, or is there kind of a general outline of a story that they give you, or how does that
they've
work?
been, they've been doing Star Wars novels for so long, and it changes so much because it's not owned by Lucasfilm anymore. So I felt very constrained. It wasn't like it wasn't as much fun as I thought it was going to be, basically.
So if this is an interesting question here from Lily. If you're acquainted with other sci-fi fantasy authors, how does it affect your experience of reading their work?
It kind of really, I'm so used to it. I mean, because I've been doing this for so long. So there are authors I know their work isn't the kind of thing I like to read. And then there's people that are, my friends that I really love their books, and I'm really excited when they come out. So I guess I just know too many people whose writing I've been reading for like 30 years.
And what kind of scenes, moments, or dynamics do you find most or least enjoyable to write?
Ah, I don't know. Most enjoyable, I think, is probably when um, you're I'm learning the characters as I'm developing them. And I think that it's very difficult for me, at least, to develop a character in isolation. It's like what develops them are all the choices they make. And so when you have characters interacting with each other, there's a lot of choices, and do people like each other, and and just so many choices. And that's what helps you really kind of figure out who this person is. And so what's the most fun is when you put two characters together and they just immediately have chemistry or immediately hate each other or something. It's just the things that surprise you in your own writing. It's almost like it's like you're creating the puzzle pieces, but then you're putting them together too, and they're coming out in the ways that sometimes surprise you.
Okay, I can see how that could be very satisfying. Let's see, good question here. Or actually, this is just a comment here from Marissa that I wanted to highlight. She said, I wanted to let Martha know that I haven't written in years, and fan fiction for her world has let me start writing again. I just didn't have anything I wanted to write about until now. It was like a years long writer's block, and I just pivoted to other creative forms. I've gotten back into writing because of you. Thank you.
Oh, well, that's very cool to hear. I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah. All right, well, we're starting to run out of time here, so I did want to give you a moment here. Is there any other upcoming projects you have that you wanted to highlight before we wrap up?
Let's see, there's I think my most recent book was the reprint of the Book of Ile-Rien, which was The Element of Fire and The Death of the Necromancer together in one volume. That's available now. City of Bones is available, the revision of that, the reprint. Wheel of the Infinite is coming out in November, and then Queen Demon will be in July. And I think that's as far as I know at the moment.
This is an interesting question. When sitting for a writing session, do you have any rituals, like a specific drink, or do you listen to music, or do you go into a specific place?
I usually drink tea. I used to have the TV on. It's kind of background noise, but as I've gotten older and my concentration is worse, I just don't do that anymore. And sometimes I'll play music, but again, it's the same thing. I'll just start listening to the music and not doing anything. So mostly I just try to keep it quiet. Um, when I first started writing, I was writing in the office where I worked, um, and there was two Wang mainframes and some other smaller computers and an overhead air cleaner, and the roar of the air conditioning system that was trying to keep everything cool. And it was a very small room, so there was just this din of noise all the time. And that's one of the reasons I think I had to write with the TV on, is because I was used to this constant noise and beeping and everything. So um, yeah, that was, I don't really have any rituals, but now it's like, it's kind of nice to be able to do it when it's quiet.
All right, let's see. I think we have time for maybe one more here. Question from Gamebird. Are there any visual differences between the sec units and combat sec units?
No, not really. The combat sec units might look slightly bigger, but not that you'd be able to tell, I think, unless you were like someone who worked with them a lot.
Maybe do one quick one here from the chat. She's asking, I wonder, how did you come up with Art's personality?
That was one of those moments where you put the two characters together and they just started talking, and it was really cool. It was you kind of have to, I don't know if it's called free writing or something, but you just kind of let yourself um, just kind of go and just come up with what's fun. And that was one of those moments. So yeah. And Art almost, or with I do a lot of rewriting for the Murderbot Diaries. That's why it takes so long. And in the original version of the story, Art wasn't in it really. And it wasn't until I went back and restarted it and realized I needed to add all this stuff that Art came out. So and it's been one of my favorite characters to write.
Great. All right. Well, I wanted to take a moment here and just thank everyone for their great questions, and thank you everyone for coming and populating our chat. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to get to everyone's questions, but you all had a lot of really good questions here. So I appreciate everyone being active and participating here. And also just want to thank you so much, Martha, for taking the time to chat with our community tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This was fun. There's some good questions.
All right, great. Well, have a wonderful evening, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thank you.